Hey everyone, this is another video of me talking a lot. I know I feel like I make a lot of these videos, and I know a lot of people don't want to watch me just talk for a long time, like it seems kind of pointless. I mean, I should be making videos of me playing games, but I do sometimes feel the need to just talk about something that's on my mind, and this topic is actually pretty relevant to this channel because this channel is mostly about adventure games. And so I wanted to kind of have an open discussion with you folks. I can't think of a better audience than you folks, the ones who subscribe to my YouTube channel here, because you probably are of all people in the world, you're probably the ones who have an informed and personal opinion about this. So I kind of want to ask an open question to you folks and kind of get your opinion on the simple question, or seemingly simple question, what is an adventure game? And I haven't titled the video yet, but that's probably going to be the title of this video. What is an adventure game? What is an adventure game? I don't know, but I think it has something to do with Sierra. Um, so the thing is, in any kind of creativity, in any form of creativity, you get different genres. And people sometimes fight about those genres and say, like in music, like some people who listen to music, some people might like hip hop, for example, and they say, I really like hip hop music. And other people might say, no, I prefer rap music. Now, to a lot of people, myself included, to me, hip hop is rap. Like, I can't really tell much difference. But people say, no, they're totally different. Like, they have totally different styles. They're completely different formats. Like, I mean, they may have some connection, but they're very different. They're very identifiably different. And to me, it's just like, well, I can't really tell much difference. I'm sorry. Or, on kind of the other big sort of popular music camp, there's rock music and there's heavy metal. So it's like, what's the difference between hard rock and heavy metal? To me, there's not much difference. To me, like, I could think of a lot of bands and say, basically, it's the same thing. But real metalheads will say, no, heavy metal is totally different. Like, metal has a very different sound to just plain hard rock. So that's just an example. But, in computer games, there are different genres. There are action games, there are strategy games, there are role-playing games, and there are adventure games, which is mostly what I'm interested in, mostly what I portray on this channel, because that's the genre of computer game that's of most interest to me. But what is an adventure game? What distinguishes an adventure game from some other type of game? So, for starters, the English word adventure, I mean, you can look in a dictionary and get the dictionary definition of what is an adventure. Now, I'm going to write my definition. I didn't get this from a dictionary. This is basically me speaking as myself, my own personal, like what I think of when I think of the word adventure. If you look in a dictionary, you'll probably get a slightly different definition. But I would say, for me, as a native English speaker, when I think of an adventure, I think of a journey of some kind. In fact, you can probably omit the words "of some kind" because that doesn't really say anything. You can say a journey or a journey of some kind, but of some kind, they're just kind of filler words, aren't they? They don't really change the meaning. So I'll delete that. Actually, I'll just say a journey in which you explore new places and face some kind of danger. I'll omit some kind of and just say face danger. In fact, the word "you" here is actually kind of let's not make it. Let's not write in the second person. Let's say a journey involving exploration of new places, and let's say confrontation of danger. How's that? Does it even need to be new places? I'm kind of divided. Should I say new places or just places? It doesn't necessarily have to be new places. I'll leave it like that. Let's usually an adventure involves seeing new places that you've not seen before. There might be exceptions, but let's go ahead and say a journey involving exploration of new places and confrontation of danger. Because there's usually some dangerous element to an adventure, isn't there? It's usually not just like going for a hike in the forest. If there's no risk involved, you wouldn't really call that an adventure. So yes, some kind of danger and some kind of exploration. That's, to me, that's probably like the most basic definition of an adventure, and by extension, also a computer adventure game. Now, the problem with this definition, I've been doing some thinking about this, and I'm just going to present my thoughts, but at the end, this is an open question that I'm posing to you folks. I'm going to present some of my thoughts on this. So the thing is, by this definition, nearly any computer game or video game is an adventure game. Super Mario Brothers is an adventure game, according to this definition, because in Super Mario Brothers, you're going on a journey, exploring new places, and also facing danger. So Contra is an adventure game. The first Kirby game, now there's a lot of buzz because of the new Kirby game, but the first Kirby game was called Kirby's Adventure. And, it was called an adventure. I mean, in this sense, it is an adventure, but it is not what we would call an adventure game. So I think we need a better definition than this. It's like this definition is getting somewhere, but it's not really, it doesn't really say what needs to be said to communicate what is an adventure game, or what we mean when we talk about adventure games, computer adventure games. Now, a lot of people will say adventure games don't rely on quick reflexes, like timing-based challenges. It's not just about mashing some buttons. You don't really have an adventure game with just like button A and button B, which is, I'm referring again to the NES controller, right? So you don't have games like, an adventure game is not just like something that you play with a couple of buttons. And it's not just like physics-based or reflexes-based, like timing challenges, which most of those arcade games are. Okay, that's fair enough. I would agree with that. But the thing is, the problem with that is I don't want to define things in terms of what they are not. I don't think that it's useful. If somebody asks you, what is this? It's not useful to say what it's not. It's like if somebody asks you, what is an apple? It's not useful to say, it's not an orange. It's not a real answer. It's like, yeah, okay, an apple is different from an orange. What about pears? Or what about lemons or watermelons or something? I mean, you can't define something by listing all the things that it's not, or all the possible ways that it's not something. So yes, I agree. An adventure game is not something just based on like quick reflexes, as action games tend to be. I would agree that that's something that differentiates the genre, but I don't want to identify or define an adventure game by what it is not. I'm trying to identify or define an adventure game by what it is, by properties that it does have and not properties that it does not have. So if we look at this now, we basically have three things. If we look at what I've written here, there are basically three things. There's a journey, there's exploration, and there's some kind of danger. Those are like the three things. Those are the three elements that make up an adventure game, right? So if you think about a game like, if you think about a game that takes place in one room, if you've been on the internet for a long time, you might remember back when Flash was still popular. I mean, I know Flash has now been end-of-lifed and Flash is hardly being used anymore because it's, long since discontinued. But if you were of the era where people played a lot of Flash games on the internet back in the day, and I am, then you probably remember, as I do, those escape the room games. And these were basically games where you were just like, you were in one room, and the whole game was just to kind of figure out how to use some stuff in the room to trigger some mechanism that opens the doors. Like there's a door out of the room, and you need to trigger that, somehow get the door to open so you can escape the room. So yeah, escape the room games. They were fairly popular back in the day, and some people would say, well, that's kind of an adventure game, isn't it? I mean, it has puzzles. It has like an inventory-based puzzle or several puzzles. So that's like an adventure game, right? I don't think it's really an adventure game because there's no travel involved. An adventure game usually has to have some element of travel. Now, I will acknowledge, of course, there have been some experimental adventure games which take place in a single room, but those are usually exceptions, and they usually are fairly short. or again, very experimental games. I mean, there are exceptions. Like, I mean, okay, a good exception is Freddy Farkas. Now, Freddy Farkas is a great adventure game, but if you've played it, or if you've seen my Let's Play of it, or somebody else's, if you've seen somebody's videos of it, somebody else play it, you probably know it takes place in one town. And it's a fairly small town. Like the whole game takes place within just a few screens, like within the few screens that is the small town. So there's not a lot of travel involved. But even that is still, I mean, it's not, a long journey. You're not traveling over mountain ranges and through forests and across deserts, but it's still enough travel that it still kind of, gives the feeling of an adventure game. But a game that takes place in like one room doesn't feel like an adventure game to me. I don't know. What do you think? Like, do you think that a game that takes place in one room can be an adventure game? I don't feel like it really is. So, those escape the room games, they're fun. They're not bad games, but they're just, they're like, I wouldn't call them adventure games. So there has to be some element of, I'll list these out here. So there has to be some element of travel, some larger journey that takes you through different kinds of environments. I'll say travel through different environments. And again, I know there are exceptions. And also, again, this doesn't really define adventure games because there are lots of games which involve travel through different environments that are not adventure games. So that doesn't really tell you much, but that's like maybe a starting point, right? And for me personally, I think I've said this in the past, for me personally, games are mostly about the environment. A lot of people get very focused on the characters or on game mechanics and things like that. I'm more interested in the environments. That's just my personal thing, but that's me personally. I have my own particular personal sort of interests, and other people might be different or are different. So, okay. Travel through different environments. Okay, fair enough. Yes, I would say that's in most cases a component of an adventure game. But again, this alone would mean that most video games are adventures. I mean, Doom is an adventure by that definition, because it involves traveling through different environments. That's ridiculous. You can't leave it at that. So then there's something like story. People will say you need to have a story for an adventure game. I think a lot of people would say this is relatively uncontroversial. They would say, yes, of course, an adventure game has to have a story, but if you think about the earliest adventures, if you think about like the original Colossal Cave, which was like the first adventure game, it was so much the original adventure game that it was just called Adventure. It was literally like some people call it Colossal Cave, but a lot of people just called it Adventure. It was so much the first adventure game that was literally just its name. There was no other adventure game. It was just Adventure. If you think about that game, it has almost no story. The story is you're in a forest and you walk around and you find treasures and you collect treasures, and that's it. There's no bigger story than that. Even the first Sierra games, like, if you think about the first King's Quest starts with zero story. You're just standing outside the castle. And if you want to get the story, you can go into the castle and talk to the king, and he tells you what he wants, and it's one screen of text. You get one screen of text, and that's it. That is literally the whole story to the game. You get one screen of text, and the rest of the game is just, gameplay mechanics. Like, I've often thought about it and realized a game like King's Quest would make a terrible story. You walk up to a rock in the forest, and you push the rock over and get a knife from under it. You go to a goat pen, and you show the goat a carrot, and the goat starts to follow you because he likes the carrot. Stuff like that. That would make a terrible story. That wouldn't be a very interesting... Like, if you read that as a book, that would be like a really boring book. That would be a stupid story. So there's really no story there, or there's hardly any story. There's one screen of text that is a story, but again, Doom had that. Or like... Wolfenstein, if you remember Wolfenstein 3D, the story of that game is built into the game. Like from the main menu, you can say, read the story. I think it's called read this in the menu. So you click on read this, and it gives you the story of the game. And it's actually several pages long. But at the end of the day, it's a premise for the game. But Wolfenstein is not an adventure game. Same thing with Doom. Like, when you finish Doom, you get like one screen of text, and that's the story, that's the plot of the game. But it's not an adventure game. There is a story there, but a story alone doesn't make an adventure game. And even if the story progresses, like even if the story continues throughout the game, that still doesn't really make it an adventure game. That's still, I mean, lots of action games have stories that develop throughout the course of the game. Like there's an ongoing story that accompanies the game, but it's still not an adventure game. It's an action game that just happens to have a story. So I don't think that a story really makes an adventure game. Not necessarily a component of an adventure game, and vice versa. What I mean by vice versa is having a story doesn't make it an adventure game. So not having a story doesn't make it not an adventure game. Having a story doesn't make it an adventure game. So, okay, so an adventure game doesn't necessarily need a story. I mean, it's nice to have one. It's okay to have a story, but I don't think it's really necessary. Like that's not really the main thing in an adventure game. So then people will say puzzles. So this is the big thing. This is usually what people focus on when they think about adventure games, puzzles. I made a long video a few years ago where I was talking about how I was becoming more accepting of the idea of walking simulators. And the main reason for that is just because I realized, and had been realizing for some time, the problem with puzzles in adventure games is often they just get in the way of the game. I've played adventure games where I was stuck on one puzzle, some stupid puzzle that just baffled me, sometimes for weeks at a time, or even months. I'm pretty sure I have had puzzles in my life where I was stuck on the puzzle for like months and couldn't figure out how to get through the puzzle. Obviously, I wasn't spending like 10 hours a day, every day, banging my head against the puzzle, but like I had adventure games where I would my progress through the game was blocked for months because I was stuck on some puzzle and had to, figure out how to get through that puzzle. So puzzles are something that we think about as a core component of adventure games, but I don't know that I would say they're the main thing about adventure games. I don't think they are. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily a key core component of adventure games. Because again, they often get in the way of the game. Like often when you're stuck on a puzzle, you can't play the game further. So the point of the game is not just to solve puzzles. There has to be something else that drives the game besides puzzles. And again, non-adventure games can have puzzles as well. There are action games that have puzzles. There are games like Heretic comes to mind, or its sequels. Like those games had puzzles, and of course the puzzle in those games was find a hidden wall to push, or find like some hidden spot where suddenly something will happen. So it wasn't like a puzzle they weren't puzzles as we would think of them in adventure games. They were kind of like, in my opinion, kind of silly puzzles that didn't really involve a lot of intelligence. They were more just like were trial and error. But, they're called puzzles in a sense. Or something like, here's maybe a better example. If you think about games like Myst and Riven. Now, Myst and its many sequels, the first of which was Riven, they had a lot of puzzles, but the puzzles didn't make a lot of sense. Like, especially that last puzzle in Riven. Remember the very last puzzle in Riven, which is like that stupid marble grid where you have like the colored marbles and you have to put the colored marbles into the right spots in the grid? That's not like an adventure game puzzle. An adventure game puzzle is like you have a feather in your inventory and you use the feather to tickle someone. I don't know. It's like, okay, it's obviously something out of King's Quest 4, but that's just one example. So, something like that, it's usually inventory-based puzzles, but it doesn't have to be inventory-based puzzles, but it's a puzzle involving the environment. It's a puzzle involving fairly realistic elements that you might encounter in your everyday life. That, to me, is, in fact, I'll write that out, puzzles involving real-world objects and situations. That's kind of a more proper definition, I guess, of what we mean when we talk about adventure game puzzles. So like that last puzzle in Riven, where you have like this huge grid of little holes, and you have like 5 colored marbles, and you have to put the colored marble into the correct hole to trigger some mechanism. That's kind of like that's not an adventure game puzzle. That's I liked Riven. I actually enjoyed Riven. I thought it was an enjoyable experience. But those games don't really play like adventure games. They play like more like just like regular puzzle games. A puzzle game, like just a straight puzzle game, is something like I don't know, what's an example? Sokoban. Sokoban, that game where you have to push the boxes into the right positions. Stuff like that. That's a straight puzzle game. There's hardly any story, or if there is, the story makes no difference to the game. It's just a straight puzzle game, and those games are fun too. I like those games, but I would never call them adventure games. They're not adventure games by any stretch of the imagination. So puzzles like that, if the game mostly relies on puzzles like that, I don't think it's an adventure game. And something like Myst and Riven, I sort of feel like they're borderline cases. They're kind of adventures because they involve exploration of different places. But the puzzles are not really adventure game puzzles. So it's like, okay, there are edge cases. There are definitely games which kind of challenge that. There are games which have puzzles, and it's like, is it really an adventure game? But are puzzles really necessary? Like, can you have an adventure game without puzzles? You probably can. I think there are a lot of games with no puzzles, which I think would probably qualify as adventure games in some sense. If you think about the example that I always come back to, just because it was one of the first games that I personally encountered that kind of fit that description, is Dreamfall, which is the sequel to The Longest Journey. Dreamfall is it's a nice game. Like, I actually enjoyed Dreamfall. It has a nice. It's enjoyable. It's enjoyable to experience Dreamfall, but it has not really any puzzles. It's more like just a walkthrough. Like, literally, you just kind of walk through the game and see different situations, but it doesn't really have much in the way of puzzles. And I guess it's an adventure game because there's not really anything else that you could categorize it as, but it's like an adventure game without puzzles. Or to cite a more recent example, here's a relatively recent example. What about a game like The Artful Escape? If you haven't seen The Artful Escape, it's basically like a wish fulfillment fantasy about some nerd who becomes a rock star. Like, it's some nerdy guy who dreams of being a rock star, and then he goes on this really epic journey. And that game really is epic in terms of its presentation. Like, it really feels like you're walking through like a huge sort of rock music acid trip from the 60s or 70s. It has great graphics. It has a great sort of mood. Like, the feel of the game is really nice, but I might allow that The Artful Escape is a great experience, but it is an experience. It is not a game. And most people who have played it would have basically said the same thing. The Artful Escape it's a nice experience if you like rock music. If you don't like rock music, then it probably doesn't have much for you. But if you like those epic sort of progressive rock sounds, which are now kind of like have passed into the era of classic rock. But if you like that kind of thing, you'll probably enjoy it as an experience. But it's not really a game. Like, it doesn't have puzzles, it doesn't have challenges. It's basically just like you walk through the environments and enjoy these epic sort of backgrounds, which are painted like, these big psychedelic colors, which, looks like psychedelic art from the 1960s, and the music to match. So, good experience, recommendable to somebody who likes that kind of thing, but not really a game. So stuff like, Dreamfall, The Artful Escape, I might allow that they're part of a new breed of adventure games made for people who like interactive stories and don't want to get hung up on puzzles. But they really are games. They're adventure games. If they are adventure games, they're very different types of adventure games. They're adventure games without puzzles. And again, I would say they're more experiences than games, which doesn't make them bad, but they're not, I wouldn't call them adventure games. So, if you think about what we mean when we say adventure games, in the 1980s and 1990s, there were a lot of, we had a lot of games, a lot of adventure games, which followed a fairly rigid formula. They all kind of mimicked this gameplay style, which had been made popular by games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion and Monkey Island. And it's like, okay, we recognize these games as adventure games because they imitated like a formula. They followed the formula that had been defined of what an adventure game is. Okay, fair enough. But in any creative medium, and I think that games are art, I'm one of those people that says that computer games are art, just like any other form of art. They have obviously room for creativity. So in a creative medium, there has to be room for creativity. There has to be ways to sort of bend the medium, if you will. And by that I mean like change the format of the medium. It shouldn't be the case that every product, every game has to follow exactly the same sort of formula of what we think adventure games should be. So, okay, so a game like, what's an example of, I don't know, Legend of Kyrandia, for example, it's not from Sierra or LucasArts, it's from a different company, but it was very obviously made in the mold of games like that. It's very obviously made to kind of imitate the template, if you will, of what's been defined as what excuse me, of what should be an adventure game. Or something like Simon the Sorcerer, another example. It came later, so it was a later adventure game, but it didn't really do anything innovative. Good game. I mean, they're good games, but they don't really do anything new. They just kind of follow a format. So I'm seriously asking, what could you do with the adventure format to kind of change it? To make something that would still be an adventure game, that would still, be like a creative sort of breath of fresh air, like a whole new paradigm, a whole new format for adventure games, but still an adventure game. Now, there are games which have pushed the format in new directions. I mean, if you think about something like, I don't know, the Space Bar it's not really a typical adventure game. Or Grim Fandango. Actually, I really like Grim Fandango. I don't usually like LucasArts games, but Grim Fandango is an exception because it's so creative. It's not just like, it doesn't just play on very, very, very established tropes like pirates or, mad scientists. It's really a very new, very fresh sort of perspective and environment, which is not prominent in popular media, and so that's why I really like Grim Fandango, and also just something different with the format, because if you played it, it's not like the way that your character walks around in that game. It's pretty different. So it's a very different feel. It has a very different feel to most adventure games, but I would say it's definitely an adventure game. It's actually it's a very good adventure game. It's a really good adventure game, which kind of does something different with the format. But you have a lot of games that mix things. Different games kind of mix things together. So a good example is Quest for Glory. Now, Quest for Glory is often considered to be among the best adventure games ever made, or it's a whole series. It's considered to be among the best adventure games series ever made. But it's not just an adventure game. They have action-based fight sequences. They have like role-playing elements mixed in where there's fighting and there's character building and stuff like that, which are things that usually don't belong to the adventure genre. Now, those things don't figure that prominently into Quest for Glory. Most of Quest for Glory, I'd say like 80-90% of it, is typical adventure game stuff. And so that's why I consider them adventure games with RPG and action elements. But is it really just a question of quantity? That's the thing. Is it really just like how much of the game involves stuff like that? Because again, Grand Theft Auto could be an adventure game because it has adventure elements. Like it has moments where you're kind of doing things which are sort of like an adventure game, but those moments are very short. So like most of Grand Theft Auto is either driving or fighting or something like that. I mean, it's most of it is action stuff. So I think it really is just a matter of quantity. Because if you think about other Sierra adventures, a lot of Sierra adventures had arcade sequences in them. Like Freddy Farkas had that shooting sequence where you're suddenly shooting all these bad guys close to the end of the game, and then after that there was that fencing scene where you're fencing with Kenny with swords. Those are action sequences, but they were fairly short in comparison to the overall length of the game. Those are fairly short sequences, and so it's still an adventure game just because those things are kind of don't figure much into the game. So I would say it really is just a matter of quantity, how much of the game branches off in other directions. So you can have hybrid games. Like if you think about Mean Streets, I don't know how many of you folks have played Mean Streets. It was the first Tex Murphy game, and later Tex Murphy games like Martian Memorandum, and then Under a Killing Moon, and then went on to different like more recent games in the series. Those games followed a more familiar adventure game format. They were more unambiguously adventure games. But the very first game in that series, it was called Mean Streets, and it was a very experimental game, I would say, because it mixes kind of different formats, different genres. Most of the game is you sitting in your flying car and just flying to places. So it does that kind of thing where a lot of adventure games, because they involve travel, they find different ways to do like a quick travel kind of thing. Like if you think, again, a good example is Quest for Glory 2. Quest for Glory 2 takes place within a fair-sized city. Like it's not a huge city, but the city's big enough that you can get lost in it walking around the streets. So I think the way that Quest for Glory 2 handled it, I think is a pretty good compromise. Basically, if you remember in Quest for Glory 2, you have to find places. Like when you have to kind of navigate the city streets to find places. But once you found a place the first time, it shows up on your map. And then after that, you can quick teleport there. So you have to find a place the first time, but after you found that place, it then shows up as an icon. You can pull out your map at any time. The place shows up as an icon on the map. And then from that point forward, you can click on that icon on the map to just zap, just to quick travel there. And I think that's a pretty good compromise. And that kind of exists in stark contrast to games like Mean Streets, where like every time you want to go somewhere, you have to actually travel there. So it's kind of like GTA. The thing about GTA, Grand Theft Auto, is half of that game is just like getting to places. So it's like your mission is go here and do something. And half of the time you're just driving to that place, like doing nothing but just driving in traffic to get there. And then the actual mission, once you arrive there, takes like a relatively short amount of time typically. So games with commutes, it's kind of a controversial thing, because I think a lot of game developers just do that to lengthen the game, just to kind of artificially extend the gameplay. So instead of having real gameplay, they just put different places and you have to actually go there to get there. And the thing is, a lot of adventure games do that though, like Police Quest, like Police Quest 1 and Police Quest 3, both have like driving interfaces, and you do that as well. Like you have to actually drive everywhere. You can't just quick travel. Police Quest 2 does quick travel, but Police Quest 3, again, like I feel like half of the game is literally just driving in your car, getting to some crime scene or going back to the police station or whatever. Like that's about half of the game is driving. But it's still considered an adventure game. So I don't know. It can kind of excuse me, it can get kind of controversial, I guess. Like you could argue, is it really an adventure game, or is it like a half adventure game and half driving game? I would say Mean Streets is like maybe half adventure game, because when you get somewhere, it sort of follows the format of an adventure game, kind of, but half of it is just flying around in your flying car. And then you have games like Omicron. If any of you have played Omicron, The Nomad Soul, that's another game that really mixes things up. It has very different elements. So it has it has kind of driving segments, kind of like GTA. It has fight segments, like a fighting game. And it has kind of adventure elements, so it's kind of an adventure game, but not exactly. So there are a lot of games that do something different. There are a lot of games which sort of push the genre boundaries and kind of question our notions of what is an adventure game. And so, okay, fair enough. The definition of what an adventure game is doesn't have to be rigid. It doesn't have to be perfectly rigid. But I would like to identify what really is important in an adventure game. So for me personally again, so I'll say what's important for me. I'll just say what's important for me personally in an adventure game. One, again, exploration of environments. So there has to be some kind of, some element of, turning things over or taking things apart to discover hidden secrets, hidden clues, something which can only be found by some element of inspection or examination or something like that. So, it's not just like you walk somewhere and you see something sitting on the ground, you pick it up and bam, that's the puzzle. That's not really a puzzle. There has to be some sort of interaction with the environment to such an extent that you kind of find things. You find things by examining the environment. So to me, that's like one of the most important things about an adventure game. Two, what's the second thing? Again, some kind of travel, which again, it doesn't have to be like a hugely crazily epic journey. Like if you think about King's Quest V, in King's Quest V, Graham walks through a whole desert. He walks across an entire mountain range. He sails across the whole sea to an island, or to a couple of islands actually. So that's a very epic adventure. Okay, it doesn't have to be like that epic. But something that's just like in one room or in a very small space, to me, that's not an adventure. I don't feel like that's an adventure. There has to be some reasonable element of travel. Like even Freddy Farkas, even though it just takes place in one town, I'm willing to accept that that's an adventure because that's at least, it has some screens that you can travel between. Like there's definitely a little element of travel there. So I feel like that some bare minimum amount of travel is necessary for it to really be an adventure game. I would say thirdly, I'll say story, but the story shouldn't overshadow the game. I say this because there are a lot of games where there is so much story that most of the game is just reading story. A visual novel. Visual novels are kind of popular, and I'm not knocking visual novels. I actually enjoy some visual novels. They're not bad. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but I wouldn't say they're adventure games because the vast majority of them is just clicking through story. It's literally just clicking through line after line after line of story or dialogue, and it's not even really a game. They kind of make it into a game because there are choices, like at different segments of the story, there are choices you have to make, and the choices you make will affect how the story unfolds. But that's just kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure story, which, again, is not bad. I'm not criticizing that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But that, to me, is not an adventure game. I wouldn't call that an adventure game. It's a novel which happens to have some minimal interactive element to it. And I'll add here, actually... I'll put some question marks. Character interaction. Now, a lot of people say that character interaction is critical to an adventure game. I don't know that I would agree with that because, again, if you think about the earliest adventure games like Colossal Cave or the original King's Quest, there is almost no character interaction, or there's very minimal character interaction. It's like, yeah, okay, you walk into the castle, you talk to the king, you get one screen of text, okay, done. You go to the woodcutter's house, and he just says, I'm hungry, or we're hungry, we have no food, and then you give them the bowl with food in it, and that's it. That's the extent of the character interaction. Most of the early adventure games were fairly lonely affairs in that you didn't have a lot of characters, and the characters that were there, you had fairly minimal interaction with them. So, there might have been some characters, but most of the game you played by yourself. Most of the game you were just a lone character going on your way by your own lonesome self. And I kind of prefer it that way because, again, a lot of games rely too much on dialogue. I know I knock LucasArts games a lot. Like I've many times I've said why about how much I don't like LucasArts games, and I'll say it again. One of the reasons why I don't like the LucasArts games that much is because they tend to be very heavy on dialogue, and they all sort of tend to have these long dialogue trees where like the whole gameplay is just clicking through different dialogue options and just watching how the dialogue unfolds. And to me, that's just like, it gets boring after a while. Like some small amount of conversation is okay, but if it's just like a long conversation that gets drawn out, and the whole gameplay, like the whole time you're just clicking on different responses and just clicking through the dialogue tree, that gets kind of boring to me. So games that have interminably long conversations and things like that to me is that's something I don't like personally. I realize some people do like it. Some people do like good conversation. I like it too. I'm not saying I dislike conversation, but if it goes on too long, it starts to overshadow the gameplay again. So just like, like the whole story element. So story, fine. Character interaction, fine. Okay, yes. But it shouldn't get in the way of the game. You shouldn't have like a half-hour conversation that interrupts the game, because that sort of disrupts the game flow, if you will. But that's just my opinion. I realize some people will disagree with that. That's just, again, this is kind of my take on what's important to me personally in an adventure game. What else is there? I mean, I guess that's pretty much it. That's all that occurs to me. But again, I realize in saying this, this is almost any video game. Almost any video game has some kind of environment that you play in and that you explore. Almost any video game has you moving around, traveling from one place to another. Almost any video game has some kind of story. So this definition is really extremely rudimentary. Like, I don't think it really gets at the essence of what an adventure game is. So again, I'm at a point here. Like I'm at the end of my rope here. Like I'm done saying what I wanted to say, and I still feel like I'm not really closer to an answer. This is an open question to all of you. Anyone who's watching this, if you're into adventure games, which you probably are, because if you watch my channel, that's most of what I have on my channel. So seriously, like an open question. I'm seriously asking, what is an adventure game? What to you distinguishes an adventure game and makes it really an adventure game or not an adventure game? And kind of a secondary question, can you name any specific games which really break the formula? Games which are very obviously not just typical adventure games that kind of imitate the Sierra or LucasArts kind of style, like games which really go off in a different direction or have notably different gameplay, but which were still very much adventure games. Can you name any games like that? Because I can probably think of a few. I mean, again, Grim Fandango, even though it is from LucasArts, Grim Fandango is probably one. I really love Grim Fandango because it's so creative, both with the setting and with the movement controls and the way that the inventory works, the way, he pulls inventory items out of his jacket and stuff like that. I mean, these are small things. Like, these are small little details. I mean, it's still basically an inventory. It's still basically an inventory. It's still basically a game where you walk around and solve puzzles. But I feel like Grim Fandango was a very sort of fresh take on the adventure formula. It's a very different sort of approach to the adventure format, and I think it works very well. Like, I give definitely a huge thumbs up to that game. I love that game. It's one of the few LucasArts games that I really love because it really is very creative, very unique, and it's a great game. But can you think of any games that really sort of kind of break the formula and don't do what a typical adventure game is supposed to do, but is still very much an adventure game? I'd be curious if you folks can name anything that you kind of feel matches that description. So yeah, I guess that's it for me. I've talked I've gone on very long. I've gone on talking for a very long time. And as usual, I've talked a lot, but I feel like I've not said very much. I feel like at the end of it all, I still don't really have a sensible conclusion to come to. I'm really at a loss. Again, I'm really trying to say, like, what is an adventure game? What is it just one of those situations where it's like, I can't define it, but I know when I see it? Like, I think there's a famous quote from some judge who was asked to define pornography, like in some pornography trial. He said, what is pornography? And he said something like, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. So is it just like that? Is it just like, well, you can't really define an adventure game, but you just have to, if you see a game, you can say, yes, that's an adventure game, or no, that's not an adventure game? Is it just like you just have to go by feel or intuition and say, yeah, I can identify an adventure game when I see it? Or is there something really definitive that you can say, yes, this is what makes an adventure game? So yeah, I'd be curious to hear your folks' opinions. So please, anybody who has anything to add, please post it in the comments below. I will be interested to see what folks have to say. And my apologies again for going on for very long and making a stupid video about me talking about things instead of playing a game. I will make further videos about me playing games. I just wanted to ask this because this is something that's kind of been weighing on my mind a bit lately. This is kind of something that kind of gave me pause for thought, because I realized I don't really have an adequate answer to what should be an important question. So anyway, I will talk to you folks later. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Talk to you all later, and bye-bye for now.